Stone, commonly known as lasso, used to be highly imported in the country for its use in building and painting. Processing it might be very hectic and time-consuming, as it takes 3 days for these people to have their final product. They start by lining and shaping of firewoods like these. After hours of cutting and shaping, the women will then take their containers to collect oyster shells and pour them on the assembled woods. When it is halfway filled, more wood is added in between before being finally filled and covered with woods. They will then light it, and this will burn for 3 days. The process, as Lamin Sanyang explained, was passed on to him by his father, who first started it and trained others within their community. According to him, they bought the cells from women harvesting oyster and also buy the firewood as their main and only raw material. The bulk of the work, he said, is manpower. The business, as Landing Sanyang also echoed, is very profitable and they are highly dependent on it. During the second day of burning, they met the fire blazing, an indication of proper burning of the cells. At the final day of burning, the firewood was all burned into ashes. Limited water was then poured on the burned hot cells and beaten to shape. It will then break into a porous shape as the air blows it. When it is finally dry, they measure in bags and off for sale. Even though they face obstacles in processing, young people like Lamin and Landing Sanyang here, with some women and elders, are relying on these oyster cells to produce limestone to make ends meet, which shows its significance. Rohibite, Grts News.
We'll now take our first break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. The top American diplomat says the risk of not acting is far greater than the risk of acting. As Secretary of State John Kerry says, a military strike is the first step towards a political solution in Syria. He's been trying to build a national consensus for action and spoke alongside his British counterpart earlier on Monday.
That he can rub out countless numbers of his own citizens with impunity, using chemicals that have been banned for nearly 100 years because of what Europe learned in World War I. If he can do that with impunity, he will never come to a negotiating table. A resolution will not be found on the battlefield, but at that negotiating table, but we have to get to that table.
But the Obama administration must also convince Congress that military action is necessary. Here's more on how the president and his team hope to make that case.
Decision on how to vote. They take a look at that video that you all made available to the world yesterday. Take a look at that and try to turn away from that.
Those videos expected to be shown at closed-door briefings starting today for all members of Congress, returning for the dramatic debate and vote. To turn the tide, the president unexpectedly showed up Sunday night at a dinner hosted by Vice President Joe Biden to sell Republican senators on Syria. And today he's sending National Security Advisor Susan Rice to the Congressional Black Caucus. But opposition is growing, even among Democrats.
My heart is broken when I see that video and you see women and children dying as a result of chemical weapons. But the big question for the Congress right now is what is the most effective way to move forward?
If I were the president, I would withdraw my request for the authorization at this particular point. I don't believe the support is there in Congress.
Now, despite Washington's campaign to get support for a military strike against the Assad government, China will not be swayed. David Mackenzie expressed China's steadfast refusal to intervene.
Greeting between President Obama and Chinese President Xi Jinping at the G20 summit in Russia. But a frosty response to President Obama's call for military strikes against Assad. After more than 2 years of brutal chaos and death in Syria's civil war, the US president says suspected chemical attacks crossed a red line. From the beginning of the crisis, China's followed a bottom line of non-interference.
If you have too much outside interference in the internal affair of any particular country, it will backfire. It most likely result in disaster for the people involved.
The policy of non-interference is decades old, but Chinese experts feel Beijing was burnt, in particular by their experience in Libya.
China has always emphasized
Beijing allowed a resolution on a NATO-led no-fly zone at the Security Council by not using their veto power, then watched how NATO became the de facto air force of the rebellion, crucial in ousting Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi, something they never wanted.
I think the Chinese position ever since then, as far as Syria is concerned, is sticking to the gun about non-interference in each other's internal affairs.
China and Russia have consistently vetoed any sanctions resolutions against the Syrian government. Unlike Russia, China has few military ties to Syria, but it does have monetary ones.
Beijing does have economic interests at stake in Syria, and it's afraid that large-scale intervention by the U.S. might be detrimental to Beijing's long-standing economic interests in Syria.
Chief among those interests, oil. Of course, China will soon be the world's largest importer of crude, mostly coming from the Middle East. So any wider conflict sparked by Syria would be devastating to China's economy.
But to the world's second-largest economy, China's trade with Syria itself is relatively inconsequential. So much of their support for Assad could be symbolic. If Xi Jinping backed a strike against Assad by the US or anyone else, it would send the wrong message inside China for a party obsessed with maintaining power.
Beijing has been supporting autocratic military juntas or otherwise one-party dictatorships in Africa and in the Middle East. So it's likely that it has some sympathy with similar autocratic authoritarian regimes around the world.
For China's leaders, like many around the world, it's not the suffering of the Syrian people that moves them, but cold, calculating self-interest. David Mackenzie, CNN Beijing.
Well-known Russian activist Alex Navalny is demanding a recount after he lost the election for the post of Moscow mayor. An ally of Vladimir Putin, Sergei Siviani, got away with 51% the vote, narrowly averting a runoff with Navalny, who came out second. Russia's leading independent electoral monitor Galas points to ballot violations that could have tipped the ballot in favor of one candidate. Let's look at this report for more.
His supporters remain defiant too. They've called for a rally to protest what they are calling a rigged election. And Navalny has insisted on an immediate recount of the ballots.
If this is not done, we will analyze even more information, find out more evidence, and present it in detail. And if the city of Moscow continues to violate the voting rights of Muscovites, we will call on citizens to come out onto the streets.
Navalny is also pushing for a runoff election, but it's unclear if his demand will be met. The winner, Sergei Sobyanin, has strong backing from the Kremlin. According to the official results, he won an absolute majority of the vote. State media has also declared him the winner by a wide margin, far ahead of Navalny's official 27% tally. Although that...
We'll now take our second break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, and now back to one of our top stories. The Vice President and Minister of Women's Affairs this afternoon presided over the swearing-in ceremony of the new Attorney General and Minister of Justice, Mama Fatima Singate. Mama J witnessed the ceremony held at the Cabinet Room, and this is her report.